formal introduction of our guests today. I just want to say welcome to everybody. We have a pretty good lineup of Colloquium speakers coming in next week. Nick Heinen from the University of Georgia, also going to talk about food systems issues. And then I think before too long, we switch gears and we'll be meeting in person. So stay tuned in for announcements coming from David Price on when we start gathering back in the Tocqueville room. But without taking any more time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Babb for the introduction of today's speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Farmer. Hi, my name is Angela Babb. I'm with the Ocean Workshop and also the Food Institute. And I am honored to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Joshua Leonis. I had the privilege of meeting Josh back in 2015, I think it was. We've done some work together, but primarily I've been really inspired and energized by the work that he's been doing at the Food Justice Lab in West Virginia, at the West Virginia University, and always looking to see what we can be doing similarly here in Indiana. It's just amazing what they're up to. I'm gonna post some links in the chat so you can check out more of that work. So today, Dr. Lohnes is gonna be sharing about food waste, hunger, and the shifting politics of charitable food assistance in the United States. And Joshua studies the moral, political, and economic place of food in the wider economy. He currently serves as the Food Policy Research Director in the Food Justice Lab, developing action research projects through data sharing tools and the planning resources that support the development of food policy and anti-hunger coalitions in West Virginia and beyond. I just want to comment that your paper was a breath of fresh air. Really, I was snapping along the whole time, just really excited to share this really important work with people that need to hear this message. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Joshua Leonis. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, well, thank you, Angela, for that introduction. And seems like I just missed the in-person visit to Bloomington, which is a bummer, but hopefully I get over there before too long to hang out with all of you. This paper is actually submitted to a French journal called Politique Américaine. It's a special issue on food systems in the US. And I grew up in France and been trying to kind of craft some networks between Francophone food system scholarship and Anglophone. And so you'll see that there's quite a bit of background on like US food system politics in there. But it's part of some broader thinking on the shifting politics of food assistance in the US and food banking in particular. And just want to give a shout out to Charlie Spring, my co-conspirator here who joined the call. We're working on a slightly more theoretical paper tentatively titled Abolish the Food Bank, Long Live the Food Bank, which is taking an abolition framework to some of these systems. So hopefully in my presentation today, that will also come through and maybe we can have a discussion about that. But I am going to share my screen and get started with a short presentation of the paper. Let me see. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Not sure why it's there, full screen. So off the National Mall in Washington, D.C., 5 men wait for their portion of food in front of a closed door. The sculptures at the FDR Memorial commemorate the Great Depression that left millions dependent on food aid to survive in the 1930s. Juxtaposed with this feeding line, the statues of two disheveled farmers recollect the overproduction and commodity price collapse that shattered the lives of agrarian families during the same period. Bread lines, knee-deep in wheat, provoked a sense of moral outrage that New Deal food policies sought to mitigate by purchasing farm excess and distributing it as hunger relief. The response to this crisis nearly a century ago coded the contradictions between food waste and hunger into federal food and nutrition policy. Indeed, this permanent feeding line continues to reverberate into our present. Even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, 46 million people were lining up to receive free food each month across the United States. In Mingo County, the loss of coal jobs has left thousands unemployed with few prospects for a living wage. With inadequate public entitlements, food charities were already a regular food sourcing strategy for 15% of West Virginians every month. Frontline charities like the Free Will Baptist Church in Parsley Bottom here are supplied by the regional Facing Hunger Food Bank, who offers a mix of foods including commodities purchased by the US Department of Agriculture and corporate food waste recovered from large retailers and manufacturers. Now, unlike the 1930s, feeding lines in the context of food gluts no longer provokes a sense of moral outrage. Today, these exist instead as sites of moral performance, blunting the injustices of a highly unequal society and normalizing a food system that segments eaters along lines of disposable income. The now multi-billion-dollar food banking economy damps the contradictions of a society awash in food surpluses, even as a significant part of the population remains at risk of hunger. Food charity scholars have argued that this form of food assistance tends to produce values that depoliticize poverty through an overt focus on solving hunger through food waste recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic saw the explosion of feeding lines across the country amid massive disruptions to our food supply chains. The solution was, once again, to divert increasing amounts of food waste toward households living through intense economic precarity, many for the first time. Many food bank workers are beginning to question the logics of revaluing food waste through charitable food supply chains, asking whom is ultimately benefiting from their labors. This most recent explosion of food charity is concerning because it further reinforces a politics of austerity that exacerbates income inequality while shielding food system and government actors responsible for driving the production of both food waste and hunger from their social obligations to ensure the right to food. The history of the modern food system can be read through the evolving social response to its feeding lines, as these fixed contradictions inherent to the production of food scarcity amidst abundance. The historian James Vernon explains how responses to hunger in the 19th and 20th centuries served to form and reinforce networks of power, crystallizing into state and supranational food institutions that wielded biopolitical control over the future direction of the food system. Today, this power is shared with agro-industrial food concerns, who are increasingly part of anti-hunger solutioning through market-based approaches to nutrition entitlement. The institutionalization of food charity must be understood within these power networks. Food banks first emerged as a charitable strategy to distribute surplus food to the poor in the 1970s. As the Reagan administration began to cut welfare and other social services in the 80s, charitable giving filled the gap. These voluntary responses to hunger relief intersected with the goals of both the federal government and food corporations. Janet Poppendieck recounts how this phenomenon became institutionalized, quote, because it fits so well into the agendas of other powerful institutions, particularly government and business. Now, since her critique was leveled over 20 years ago, the amount of food waste recovered and redistributed by food banks in the US has increased sixfold and continues to explode under the COVID-19 pandemic. Last year, the Feeding America Network distributed over 6 billion pounds of food waste to feed the poor through 200 regional food banks and their 60,000 local food charity affiliates across the country. Though framed as a response to food insecurity, this growth is in fact a supply-driven trend that has historically done little to change the dynamics of food insecurity related to broader economic conjunctures. Now, Feeding America has grown into the second largest nonprofit in the country. Its food and funding partners include powerful agro-industrial actors who are now directly influencing the framing of hunger relief causes, zero waste initiatives, obsolete inventory donations, and infrastructure improvements throughout the network. In the process, these companies significantly reduce their food waste disposal fees, boost their image as good corporate citizens, and collectively claimed nearly $4 billion in tax credits last year. The federal government also maintains an important and active role in food banking networks through the Emergency Food Assistance Program, or TFAP. The USDA Agricultural Marketing Service channels billions worth of surplus agricultural commodities into food banking networks. Some of these purchases are entitlements allocated through the Farm Bill, while others are so-called bonus foods, relieving industry-specific production gluts. Most recently, for example, our trade war with China has resulted in large amounts of food flowing through food banking networks. The Farmers to Families Food Box program played a similar role to alleviate COVID-related market disruptions in the food service sector. And most of these government contracts ultimately benefit profit-driven shareholders of an ever-consolidating food industry. The complementary relationship between federal agricultural surplus removal and Feeding America's enrollment of corporate funders and food industry partners has resulted in a top-down food banking governance structure that is largely beholden to the interests of powerful agro-food system actors, one that increases social distance between givers and receivers. Focusing on the historical antecedents of the institutions that have come to regulate food waste donations across anti-hunger networks in the US, the paper explains how food banks maintain the hegemony of a moral economy of hunger relief that legitimizes the status quo of an exploitative, environmentally destructive, and racist food system. Those with an economic and political interest in regulating surplus through charity benefit from the deployment of discourses that reinforce food scarcity logics inherent to the commodification of food. They feed off of the sacrifices and compassion of local anti-hunger groups to consolidate power and accumulate more wealth. Laying bare these institutional dynamics, the question that begs to be asked by those laboring within these networks is the following. To what extent does the corporate food regime need hunger and the food bank's current response to it to function? While the USDA and large food corporations provide an increasing amount of food to this network, they do very little to cover the costs of distributing all of this food waste. Instead, funds to operate the network are largely raised from local community-based organizations to subsidize the cost of distributing industrial food waste to low-income households. It's extremely concerning that few policy and funding discussions center on the day when food charity is no longer needed. Over the past 2 years, our response has demonstrated that we're doubling down on this strategy, raising further questions about the long-term role that food banks can play in addressing the root causes of hunger. What type of food system are we supporting when we fund food charity? What if the billions of dollars fixing the food banking economy in place each year were instead reinvested in community food security initiatives that worked to dismantle a racist, colonial, and profit-driven system that simultaneously produces food waste and hunger? Do food banks still have the capacity to engage in work that meaningfully addresses the root causes of hunger? Or are they merely appendages of agro-food supply chains that offer a convenient and socially palatable vent for the excesses of our corporate food regime? What would the food banking economy look like if it were not put to the service of the capitalist food system? We have to believe that it's possible to end hunger, that fair food policies can ensure the right to nutritious food for all while working to restore an ecologically viable and economically just food system. Food charities should not be discounted in their potential contributions to the food justice and food sovereignty movements, because they occupy a central role in the moral economy of hunger relief. However, because they're currently so entangled with dominant agro-industrial supply chains and hierarchical corporate structures that serve special interest groups, it's currently difficult for them to do so. A project that rewrites the call to charity toward food justice must work to build solidarities between food banks, local charities, and grassroots organizations working to push back against the monopolistic dynamics that limit our collective ability to reclaim control of our foodways and advance the right to food. Now, this will take risks and sacrifices that go against the impulse to blindly solve hunger in the short term with the hope of gaining legitimate community food security in the longer term. In West Virginia, where we're beginning to see the emergence of such alliances, our 2 regional food banks serve now 20% of the state's population and combined to distribute over 45 million pounds of food last year, a number that's tripled in less than a decade. They do so through a combined budget of $5 million, nearly half of which is raised via philanthropic capital. The combined network of 550 agencies raises an additional $9 million a year to distribute food waste to the poor, and depends on 7,000 volunteers each month to do so. But both food banks in West Virginia realize that it will take much more than charity to end hunger, and are actively working with a host of partner organizations throughout the state to do so. They're organizing for policy change with members of the West Virginia Food for All Coalition at the state and federal level to advance the right to food. The Turnrow Appalachian Farm Collective is forging links with food banks in support of procurement strategies that advance the work of food organizations and cooperative businesses working with historically marginalized communities toward restorative justice. Together, these organizations are working toward the long-term viability of a regional food system that redistributes wealth more equitably and maintains a stronger ethic of including voices from below into democratic governance processes. This intersectional work is difficult. It takes time and trust building, especially in a competitive fundraising environment where every organization depends on philanthropic investments to advance their work. Continuing to build such alliances will take patience and a willingness to invest in projects that may not be immediately measurable, nor meet professionalized standards of corporate accountability. It is, however, essential to build resilient food systems that ensure healthy food access for all. At the national scale, Closing the Hunger Gap is a budding movement of charitable food workers whose stated mission is to, quote, expand hunger relief efforts beyond food distribution towards strategies that promote social justice and address the root causes of hunger. Since 2013, their conferences have fostered conversations about institutionalized racism, structural inequalities, alongside workshops on the right to food, strategy sessions for civic engagement on issues such as affordable housing, minimum wage increases, and immigrant labor rights. The organizers' aim, many of whom work within food banking networks, is to both challenge and encourage their colleagues to tackle the intersectionality of hunger and build political power with those that they serve, elevating political agency of marginalized voices in the food system. This movement explicitly challenges the dominant hunger relief narratives coming from Feeding America and their corporate sponsors, who continue to measure their success from a distance in pounds of food distributed. Now, there remains a significant amount of institutional tension for those attempting to move their organizations towards social justice work. One of the leaders of the Closing the Hunger Gap movement recounted the trials he faced working from within the food bank to organize for change. Quote, "I've been told I'd be fired a few times. I've even said I'd quit a few times. There have been moments of incredible highs and incredible lows. As an organization, we've accomplished some great things though. We're now committed to moving from a charitable food organization toward a social justice organization." Now, charitable food networks are complex, made up of people with differing ideologies and various political and ethical claims to action. They remain connected through the food waste and food insecure households that bind them all together. Reviewing the tensions and contradictions inherent to the food banking economy in this paper provides an opportunity to think about ways in which charitable food organizations might take advantage of slippages and pressure points within this broader institutional framework as the basis for strengthening the food justice and food sovereignty coalitions working to confront the corporate capture of our food system. Some are already engaging on these fronts, while others are wary of politicizing the production of hunger for fear of losing access to resources essential to the smooth execution of their work. Food banks in the United States are thus at a crossroads. Subordinate to dominant relations of power in the food system, they are nevertheless also capable of meaningfully confronting that power because they occupy such an essential role in the moral economy of the corporate food regime. Their resistance to an exploitative, environmentally destructive, and racist food system cannot be an individualized response, however. And a project that rewrites the call to charity must build solidarities between food banks and allies in the broader movement for food sovereignty. Those of us with the resources to do so must begin to think through pedagogies of accompaniment that strengthen the links between alternative and charitable food networks to push back against the monopolistic dynamics that currently limit food banks' ability to enact transformative food system change. This work has already begun. How it will now be nourished or starved remains a question that should concern us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that brief. I wish you could talk longer, but we want to build in all this time for Q&A. So we've got a little bit over a half hour. I'm going to help kind of monitor the order that hands are going up and help Josh kind of answer people in order. Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question or put it in the chat. I see Dan's hand up first, and then I see Jamie in the chat. So we'll start with Dan.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh, for a really nice paper. It was super interesting to read. One of the things that we've seen emerge here in the Midwest is the emergence of faith-based food banks that essentially align themselves against Feeding America, in part on sort of ideological bases, I would argue. To what extent have you seen that in West Virginia, and how does that alter your conclusions and sort of your prognostication for the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, 90% of the local agencies distributing food in West Virginia have some kind of faith-based affiliation, mostly on a spectrum of Christian ideology, which then ends up informing their feeding practices, the rules they put into place, and these kinds of things. I have heard discourse from one organizer trying to bring in a branch of the Midwest Food Bank, which I think is up your way, right? With the narrative of like, well, we don't want government red tape. We're not Feeding America. We're a different like kind of organization. And so you are seeing the like splintering in political contests over whom food bank networks should be serving. My hope is that we would begin through Christian groups to develop pedagogies that resonate with them. So on this idea of our sacrifices being leveraged for the wrong reasons, I often point to Christ in the temple turning over the tables and saying like, my house will not be used to exploit the poor. How do we use those kinds of discourses within faith-based charities to kind of explain that their labors are being co-opted, right? Their sacrifices are being co-opted to this broader governance system that's generating value for the powers that be. So, I mean, this to me is a very long-term pedagogical project, but there are openings in there to get there, basically. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, and next up we have Jamie Carini.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. And thanks, good job on the last name pronunciation. But you're studying Sicily, so that makes sense. Yeah, so Joshua, thank you so much for your paper and for taking on this really fascinating work and challenging work. If you keep going in this direction, you may have public enemies if you're not careful. But no, I'm wondering. I have a historical question. So you talked about how the idea of food banks and food lines were the idea of food banks in particular were encouraged by the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And I'm wondering, after the Great Depression, do we see that the Truman administration rather, do we see like the government pulling back from food banks, or once Roosevelt gets involved, are they just all in from there on?
Yeah, well, actually, the history of food banking starts really to explode in the 1980s after Reagan. But what I argue is that the structures that were put into place to revalue food waste were already there since the 1930s, which go all the way back in the paper to some of the social contests around food system issues leading up to the New Deal. So with New Deal, redistribution wasn't really explicitly through the nonprofit industrial complex that we've come to know today. It was mostly county-based. Those distributions also form the basis for the current food stamp or SNAP program, where you would purchase stamps and then redeem them for surplus agricultural commodities. So what I'm trying to do in the paper is look at the lineage of how food banks came into being, because a lot of the literature actually starts in 1980. And a lot of the literature is also saying, we need to exit from food banks. Food banks are the problem. We need to go back to the welfare state as a means for folks to access food. But my question is, is giving people more income to purchase food at Walmart or at Kroger or any of these other large systems that we have in place actually going to, like, if we eliminate the food bank, are we eliminating the disease in our food system? So my hope is, like, how do we leverage the food bank in this massive infrastructure that's there, like highly capitalized now, billions of dollars. The Mountaineer Food Bank has a fleet of 30 trucks. They have refrigerators and freezers all across the state, right? And they're now beginning to integrate with regional food economies, but they're still caught in this, century-old dilemma. And they're not always super active in being radical, right? But certain food banks are. And so my hope with this paper and, the one I'm trying to write with Charlie is, do we look at food banks as the disease or the symptom of the disease? And just like you need to, we'll use vaccines as an analogy, like you have to use a part of the disease to inoculate yourself against it. It's like, can we use a part of the food bank, which is a symptom of this disease, to inoculate ourselves against the broader agro-food complex that has structured so many of our lives? And it's a debate within, like, charitable food scholarship in general. Do we abolish the food bank or do we reform the food bank? So this is the question that I'm opening up in this paper. And again, it's for like this French audience, and they're just trying to understand what in the world is going on in the US food system to begin with. So hoping to dig a little bit deeper into these questions in another iteration of this.
Thanks. I see Brian has his hand up next.
Okay, thank you. Interesting paper with a bunch of, good critical analysis. Almost at the end of the paper, you talk about how the food banking economy might yet begin to work itself out of existence by fostering community food security networks in its stead. And so I'm interested if you can say some more about how that would work, especially, well, it's better I just ask it as an open question that way. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, taking the West Virginia example again, which is the one that I'm familiar with from my ethnography, our two food banks are the largest food hubs in the state by far. All right, they employ together about 100 people, and most of those folks, I would say 80%, are currently working on revaluing corporate food waste. There's another 20%, like new local food coordinators or community outreach engagement folks that work in the food bank that are funded by different funding streams to basically figure out how do we repair this broader problem of the production of hunger in our midst, rather than just dumping food. And so, an example is we have this group of a collective of about 15 to 20 farmers under the umbrella, the Turnrow Appalachian Farm Collective. They're trying to increase production to be able to sell into schools, into hospitals, and these kinds of things. Their largest client right now is the Mountaineer Food Bank, who's committed $50,000 a month to local food purchases. And it's a huge boon for this like regional network of farmers that they actually have a market to sell into. Now it's fraught, it's complex, because again, they're not necessarily developing agency within local communities. It's still like, oh yeah, we'll buy farmer produce and dump it over here. But the CEO of Mountaineer Food Bank is now on the board of the Turnrow Appalachian Farm Collective. So these new types of alliances are forcing a different kind of conversation in these networks that I think is hopeful. And another interesting thing is that like public comment after the Farm to Food Bank or Farm to Families Food Bank program that was implemented by the Trump administration, the USDA opened public comment saying like, how should we improve this? We saw all across the country, food bankers, charitable food workers submit public comment, and there was a 12-hour hearing that resulted in the USDA saying, okay, we're going to restructure TFAP and put $400 million into purchases with local socially disadvantaged farmers. Okay, now that's huge compared to what the federal government has traditionally been doing of just purchasing, excess from Del Monte or Kellogg's or whomever. So there is a shift even policy-wise in these groups organizing to change procurement practices from the federal government. So yeah, I'll leave it there. And I hope that somewhat answered your question, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. I could say more, but better to let other people.
All right, great. Next up, I see Dan, but I want to actually interject and ask a question myself, which is with your work with the Global Solidarity Alliance. Sorry if I'm butchering that name. I'm missing a word there, but Are you seeing this food banking economic model roll out in a lot of other places around the world? And like, what is that alliance wanting to do about it? Or what's, is there a strategy there to kind of disrupt this from becoming like an international model, considering we're talking about a global food regime?
Yes. So there definitely has been an expansion of food banking networks along the US model. Some Western European countries began their own type of food banking also in the 1980s, but what we saw post 2008 financial crash is even economies that traditionally had very strong social safety nets like Sweden and Finland and Germany see the rise of food banking networks and economies. And if you look at who is kind of pushing that, it is this very concentrated corporate food sector that benefits from revaluing their waste in this way. So the Global Solidarity Alliance formed to kind of raise a red flag around the development of the global food banking network, which was seeded by Feeding America. Okay, Feeding America actually subsidized, along with Walmart and other large players in that space, subsidized the formation of the global food banking network. So now you have all across the world, and I think it's 40 different countries, affiliate food banks of the global food banking network. And what GSA is trying to do is both raise a red flag, like, hey guys, don't reproduce the US model. Like, the US hasn't even signed on to the Covenant for Social and Economic Rights, which enshrines the right to food. A lot of these countries have, and you can't ensure the right to food through charity. That's basically what we're saying. But even within the GSA, there are different tensions as to what the future of the food bank is. We have food bankers like Robert, who I quoted, that works in Tucson, Arizona, that's a part of a Feeding America food bank and working from within to try to create community food security networks. And their food bank actually has an $8 million budget for community food security initiatives, gardens and food cooperatives. And they seeded a Fight for 15 campaign in the city of Tucson, which will do a lot more to relieve food insecurity in their community than just distributing waste, right? But those campaigns also came at the expense of losing board members and losing funders and these kinds of things. Then you have kind of the faction in GSA that's just like, food banks need to disappear, period. Like, they have no social value because they are like this neoliberal expression of our food system. So I don't know if Charlie wants to comment. She's also a part of that network. And from a UK perspective.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I mean, just to voice the fact that the Global Food Banking Network sponsors FareShare, which is the UK's largest food banking network. And in 2016, I traveled to the US and was very struck by seeing adverts for food banks, like in public on buses and things. And it was only a couple of years before I started seeing adverts in the UK on television for our version of Walmart. Asda is sponsoring FareShare, and we're feeding the hungry using very similar kind of moral aesthetics. So it's certainly something that we've seen in the UK, and the GSA involves members from the UK and Canada at this point who have been trying to develop counter approaches. We kind of center around the right to food. So in Scotland and parts of England, you're seeing an effort to focus on cash-based responses to food insecurity rather than charity first, having seen the UK government, for example, fund food banks in the last few years under the auspices of food waste reduction. So we're trying to uplift those examples. We've developed a podcast called Rights Not Charity, so trying to set out some of the very complex allied issues around the global food regime and its link to charity, and trying to give some tangible ways to see that differently and maybe respond differently from within charitable networks. The other thing that Josh has been involved with is a Right to Food Atlas, which was in response to the Global Food Banking Network putting out a food policy atlas, which I see as a bit of an agent of deregulation. So Global Food Banking Network encouraging countries like India to adopt similar policies that support food waste redistribution. So around things like tax credits in already sort of under funded tax bases. So Josh has been working with some students and some colleagues to try and develop a counter atlas, which would look at policies that would support a right to food. But just to finish, we do also meet this tension within the Global Solidarity Alliance around the role of income-based solutions. You know, is it enough just to give people more money if we haven't solved these wider issues of ecological sustainability, the treatment of migrant workers, etc. So it's a complex thing, but you know, and always open to new members. Thanks for the invitation, Josh.
Yeah. Yeah, and if anyone is interested in that Global Solidarity Alliance, we meet on the first Thursday of the month and usually have like kind of a speaker series. So you can just sign up there on the website I put in the chat.
Thank you so much. I just learned so much in only a few minutes. So next up we have Dan and then Jamie again. Dan?
Yeah, I want to kind of touch on, kind of take you further based on what you answered Brian and also Angela somewhat. Mm-hmm. And to, I guess maybe the easiest way to ask my question is if you were to solve this issue to your satisfaction, what would you do? In the sense that, I mean, on the one hand, while we're creating even an income-based solution, you know, that doesn't happen overnight. So we have to retain something that looks like a food bank and pantry system, at least for a while. So how do you see this? You know, I'll give you, say, a decade. Solve this for me. How would you do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's like, solve it with, you're giving me $4 billion in the equivalent of tax breaks, and you're giving me $5 billion. That's like from what the federal government spends, and I have $9 billion to solve this, and I come up with programs? Or am I solving it by 10 years of organizing people through pedagogies that explain kind of some of the dynamics of this food system? And
I'm feeling generous today, so I'm going to give you the billions.
Yeah, well, with the billions, I would just fund the equivalent to the CFP project at the USDA that's vastly underfunded, that requires community match, that is, you know, very helpful, innovative, and has seeded wonderful projects all across the country, but they get about $2 million a year. So give that 9 billion instead of 2 million. But I think on a broader organizing front, what I was thinking through in my dissertation was like, what if the food bank was actually organized enough, and the food bank workers were organized enough to go on strike for 1 week? What would happen? And what would their demands be in terms of nutrition assistance reform, in terms of taxation reform? So imagine the food bank goes on strike. All of a sudden behind Walmart, we have masses and masses of perfectly edible food that's being discarded. So it makes visible the absurdity of our food system, for one. And secondly, people begin to figure out alternative strategies like, oh man, you're hungry, come over to my house, I'll feed you. Like, it creates more of a sense of community again around how we care for one another, rather than this large top-down, very undignified approach to caring for one another. And we had a conversation at our last GSA meeting because this guy named Cody Cava, who was a employee of the San Luis Obispo Food Bank in California, wrote an open letter decrying some of the contradictions in his food bank around resolving hunger. He, along with 2 of his colleagues, were fired the next day for writing that letter. Okay. And food bank workers, which I talk a lot about in this paper, are in this weird positionality of wanting to address hunger, wanting to do food system work, but caught in the contradictions. And they have absolutely no power to influence this because there is no food banking union. But there are thousands of food bank workers. And if you count all of the charitable food workers, I've been thinking through what would it mean to organize them in that manner over 10 years. Then it's like, hey, you better pass the child tax credit or the food banks are going on strike. That's a really, really different kind of political power. And I understand it's one that we're not at all close to yet, but I think it's one that we can begin to at least talk about.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Jamie, you're up next.
Sure. I wanted to ask you about the quality of food at food banks. Do people get to choose, say, if they prefer non-GMO, gluten-free food? Is that an option for them? Or are they pretty much stuck with the cheapest, available product? And how, moving forward, then could food banks also be used to help people be able to, satisfy preferences, particularly because we all have different health needs?
Yeah, that's an issue of concern throughout the network, and even with Feeding America, developing algorithms around quote unquote foods to encourage that measure how healthy or supposedly healthy the foods that they distribute are, and the food banks are ranked on how many foods to encourage they're distributing. Individual food banks and pantries do sometimes set up client choice, where it's more akin to shopping, and you can choose on the shelf. They'll develop a ticket system where you can choose X amount of foods, and if you're gluten-free, if you're lucky enough to find gluten-free product, then you can choose that. There is a huge push, mostly related to the healthism and kind of pharmacy type programs emerging, where food banks and pharmacy are intersecting. I don't know if it's like produce prescription programs. So if you have diabetes or hypertension, obesity, you can go to your doctor. They will prescribe a note that says you need to eat veggies. But again, and you get those veggies for free, but it's again a little bit of an odd system that you have to prove that you're sick to get access to healthy food. So yeah, but by and large, while food banks are working on creating access to more healthy food options, they're still dependent on quote unquote whatever falls off the truck, which might be mint chocolate chip Oreos that just didn't sell because the market research wasn't very good. And that's pallets and pallets of mint chocolate chip Oreos end up in the food bank and then out into our communities.
All right. And then next we have Brian and then Wes. Brian?
Okay, I'm going to push a little bit here. and apologies or do what it doesn't work. But my impression, I could be wrong, is that a lot of the stuff in terms of community agriculture, community gardens, community supported agriculture, local markets, in the US context kind of embraces a very non-political framing and something that can appeal to a whole range of people concerned with family farms and so on. Whereas reading your paper, a bunch of it sure seems to come out of a conclusion, really radical analysis and explicitly, shall we say, anti-corporate framing. Includes all the things that can go wrong, have gone wrong in terms of capitalism. And so how you think about that and what you may want to do, and it might derail the discussion, but in the US context, I think go ahead and raise, and like Jamie was raising, the example of defund the police, where there was a whole lot of serious study and thought and analysis that did not just kind of pop up or was not just one person. Nevertheless, there are different views, but given how this played out and is still playing out politically, there's certainly room to question whether different framings might have opened up different sets of opportunities. So this question of what kind of framing, the kind of thing a lot of local agriculture do, very broad-based, versus much more, whatever you want to call it, radical or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's an extremely valid question, especially, Julie Guthman wrote way back in 2006 how like alternative food networks recreate neoliberal subjectivities in terms of like, how we can solve this problem through individual consumption. If I just go shop at the farmer's market, then I am being a good actor and I've played my part, et cetera. But then, is this alternative food economy actually open for a broader swath of the population than, the 30% that can afford it? We know that farmers markets tend to be like very white spaces. They produce, white agrarian reproduce white agrarian imaginaries. And there's been a lot written about this. Like Alison Alkin was one of the early scholars thinking through like how much can alternative food networks actually change the dynamics coded into a colonial racist food system that has its roots in a 400-year project of plantation-based economies, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that food banks have the opportunity to like introduce more and more people into alternative food networks, people that would otherwise never have the capacity to engage in them. Food banks, with their institutional weight, can come and say like, hey, would you like to participate in a CSA, a community supported agriculture share? I will subsidize that for you at 80%, right? And so you can actually participate in your local food and farm economy, even though you might not have the income to do so. I, as this big institution in my city, can raise money to subsidize funds for you to engage. Other networks that I think are alternative food networks that we need to learn from are places like the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, that's very cooperatively based. So how do we create systems that actually share wealth in our food system? Are we, creating alternatives that are based on a profit maximization model or a profit sharing model? And again, the food bank as a nonprofit, like I'm just trying to break even every year, can also have a role to play in developing cooperative food economies. I'm hopeful for that. I mean, they're not there yet. But these are the exact tensions that I'm trying to raise in the paper around the politics of food banking is, how are you aligning yourself in these emergent questions around food politics in the US? Are you actually listening to historically marginalized groups and what they want out of the food bank. An interesting thing, through the GSA, I met someone working at the American Friends Service Committee in New Mexico with Latinx and indigenous farmers there. And there was a farm to food bank program. So she connected her farmers, a group of about 35 producers, to the food bank during the COVID pandemic. They were previously selling to like upscale Albuquerque restaurants, and those restaurants obviously shut down during lockdown. And they said things like, I feel so much better selling into the food bank because it's my people eating this food. It's not just the rich that are eating the food that I grow, right? So that's an interesting part of reconciling these like tensions in the alt food economy that you bring up, where the food bank is already active in recoding those relationships. But again, there's a really, really long way to go. And a lot of work to be done on food bank boards, like who is actually being represented on those boards, and all of these issues.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question from Wes.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation and your paper. Sorry if this question is a little meandering. And if it was covered in the paper, I didn't get all the way through it, but I'm just interested in like how this dynamic relates to kind of the individual social and familiar connections between people who are hungry and these food banks. So in particular, I was interested when you're talking about like what might happen if a food bank goes on strike till some sort of legislation is passed. And I'm just interested how that plays out between those food banks and the people whom they are related to, who may be less dialed into these issues because they're mostly hungry. And sure, they would benefit from policy change, but they might be a lot less invested because they just simply don't have the resources or the time to kind of work towards those things. So if you could just talk more about power in relation to individual hungry people, I think I'd be really interested.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So Dan Warshawski had a great paper that came out in, I think it was 2010, titled New Power Relations Served Here. And he looks at the way that food banks slowly became the nodes of power in charitable food networks, away from local charitable food agencies. And, largely low-income, food insecure households don't have that much interaction with the food bank. They interact with their local church that may have a food ministry, or the family resource network funded by the state that has a food pantry. These are where the social connections are actually made, and where I would argue we need to have more pedagogy about the broader food banking economy. What's interesting about the food bank is that they are at the middle of all of these power dynamics, and could, they could do more along with their local agencies to cultivate a sense of cooperativism, of even just collecting stories from people that they serve, these kinds of things. There's still a long ways to go. But basically you have these structured layers of governance that, as I say in the paper, create institutional distance between givers and receivers. And so when we abolish the food bank and recreate whatever iteration of it is, how are we really thinking through connective tissue and food as commons, in a sense? How are we recommoning our lives around food?
It's awesome to end on the commons at an Ostrom workshop colloquium. That's pretty perfect. So thank you. I hope everyone can join me in a round of applause for our presenter today. This is just great. I think we just need so much more time for conversation and pedagogy and building solidarity. So thanks everyone for being here. There's lots of helpful links in the chat to different resources. Check out that rightsnotcharity.org and their podcast and the Atlas. All sounds really great. Thanks everyone for being here, and thank you especially Dr. Lohnes for joining us.